Thank you, Helen, and thank you very much to all of the alliances for putting on today. I think it's fantastic to have what I hope is the start of many conversations about both CSW 58 and also planning, of course, for CSW 59. It was an incredible privilege to go on the government delegation as one of the two NGO reps this year to CSW, and so I would also like to thank the Office for Women and also DFAT for the opportunity. It was an incredible delegation, and you've heard this morning it was a much smaller delegation than we've had in previous years, both in terms of having less NGO reps and also in terms of having less government reps. And so it was a stretched delegation, and I think they did an incredible job of supporting Sue and I to be able to have a really fantastic experience of CSW. I have completely, while we've been talking this morning, rewritten what I was going to say, because I had initially planned to talk through the events that we attended, some of the outcomes of those, some of the things that we did across the fortnight. But I think partly that's been covered, but I also get a sense from the room that there's a bit more interest in some of the outcomes, tactics, next steps. So very happy after today, online or face-to-face where it's possible, to have a chat about the activities, what we actually did, but I thought I'll keep my comments focused on the tactics and that side a bit more. So one of the things about the role of an NGO delegate to CSW is it's quite different to the role of attending as an NGO, and I'm really lucky that in my day job I'd attended as an NGO, so I had a decent understanding of the kind of process and the scale of CSW, which I think if it was your first time can be really confusing and overwhelming. And so it was quite useful, I think, for Sue, who was a new person in the space, and that balance of having someone who had actually been before, at least to kind of get the where should we be and when. Some of my initial sort of thoughts about what the role of an NGO rep on the government delegation are, finding out where people need things urgently. Sue needs coffee within about 35 minutes of waking up. And that was a key lesson for me to learn. Sue Harris-Rimmer, for those of you who don't know her, has got to be one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. And the opportunity to work with her and learn from her was just incredible. Another one of my key roles was trying to digest the sheer volume of information that Sue's brain can download in a really quick space of time. So summarising became one of my core responsibilities. The mantra that Sue and I adopted was the WWJTD, what would Jinting do, mantra for CSW. And you know, part of our role was really logistics. It was about knowing where we had to be, what time, getting people moving, getting people in the door. Sue and I both did some seat warming because these events are crazy. You have to fight for your seats. So if the minister's turning up, someone needs to actually be sitting in our seat so that there's not 35 NGO delegates sitting in it by the time the government delegation arrives. We were named the Twitter bandits, could often be found sitting on the floor behind the minister, tweeting, because part of the role was about engaging people back in Australia and also linking with the delegates who were in New York but may not be able to have gotten into the event. So constantly trying to keep information flow going. And I'll come back to how we share information at the end. Representing the Australian government at different events, so purely on a numbers game. There were times where one of us or both of us would have to go and be in a room representing the Australian government. I think week one, we did a fair bit of learning, people coming up to us and saying, what's the Australian government's position on that? We will definitely get back to you on that. By week two, will Australia agree to this? Sure. So you didn't hear that, Murray. That never happened. Yeah, that's right. So I think the confidence builds in that first week. You do have a bit of time to really learn from and meet the other government reps because they're a really big asset. So some of the other governments also have NGO delegates. And so that group became pretty tight pretty quickly and were able to just text each other and say, look, I'm in this room, I feel like you should be as well, which was really helpful. We did, as it's been mentioned, run a daily debrief for the NGO delegation, and that had anywhere between 10 and 35 people attending each day. And it was a commitment we made to say every single day there will be us space. Initially it was outside the UN, and then in week two it moved into the UN, where Australians can come together. We can brief the NGO delegates on some of the issues of the day, what the Minister and the Ambassador have been doing, and hear from you concerns, issues arising, things that we may not see. As Murray said, one of the things we couldn't do this year was go to a lot of the side events. So having that briefing was hugely beneficial for us because we could actually say, okay, did anyone get to this event? You know, the minister's really keen to hear about it. Or did anyone get to this because we're discussing it at something tomorrow? And that was, I think, really useful. We also, I think unexpectedly, but I think now that we've worked it out, it could be something we plan to do, built a really fantastic relationship with the Pacific delegates who were there. And so in week one, we had Sue as an incredible resource. She teaches negotiations at ANU. She actually ran a workshop around interventions, making representations, some of the tactics for when to raise issues, which for some of the Pacific delegates who were at CSW for the first time and who may not have been supported the way Australia is by our mission, was really useful and helped us build really great relationships, which saw us, you know, getting really excited when we heard some of the Pacific language get up in the second week. But in the second week, once we got the next draft of the text, you know, these documents are 20 pages long, 30 pages long. And so what we did was actually got all the Pacific delegates again in a room and cut the document up and said, right, you two are reading part A, you two are reading part B, you three are reading part C, and then we'll all report back to each other. And it was a really fantastic way of actually getting through a really big document in a level of detail, but also being able to highlight for each other, okay, paragraph 56, Tonga, you identified this was a really big concern for you, you've lost your language there, you need to be on that. Australia, be aware of paragraph 55, you said there was one of the issues. And so I think what that did was really kind of build a trust and an exciting sort of platform. I know that iterations of that discussion have happened in the past, but I'd really encourage the delegation to keep doing that next year. Part of our role absolutely is information and research. And so some of that is coming out to the NGOs and saying, we need advice on X issue and getting a series of fact sheets or a series of briefings on a particular issue, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But sometimes it's as quick as we are the next person to speak and we need a word right now. And so literally phones, iPads, computers, trying to Google, trying to find the information that's needed really quickly. And I remember on about the third day of negotiations, I had one word that Tanisha, our negotiator, raised, and it got in, and I thought, CSW, tick. And then I thought, oh wow, that's really bad. That's one word. That's not, you know, doesn't make you an effective NGO delegate. But I think it's about realising that some of these wins are really micro, but they're really important. We also had obviously the primary role is to ensure that information flow between the government and the NGOs happens in a way that's timely, useful, considered. And so I would absolutely take your feedback on how that worked. But I hope that there were steps taken. We had a Facebook page, we had the online Twitter campaign. And then in week 2, when it became clear that there were still some people who weren't getting the information, we did revert back to the ever famous email list where we could. We took a range of informal meetings. And so there were meetings that the government delegates may not have been able to take in their timeframes, which we could take and hear concerns. And so particularly for international NGOs, we had quite a few meetings with the likes of CARE, Oxfam, who may not have had other strategies in to the network. And we obviously attended events. And the other sort of major thing that we ended up doing was covering one of the key resolutions, the HIV and AIDS resolution. So at CSW there is both the agreed conclusions, which is kind of considered the main game, but then there's a series of resolutions that get negotiated, some of which Australia has a really strong involvement in, some of which we don't, and part of that's about capacity, and they all get negotiated simultaneously, so it's really tricky, but Sue and I did get fairly involved in the negotiations around the HIV resolution, and that was a really interesting and challenging process. So that's my kind of summary of what the role of an NGO delegate, I think, is in reality. And I hope that's useful. What it isn't, and I think I was probably expecting that I would get the opportunity to attend more of the events and really have the time to think about the issues and hear from NGOs internationally about some of the issues. And I think just in terms of being honest, that wasn't the role. And I think also sometimes it's about letting go of your own organisations or your own individual priorities and recognising that actually this is not necessarily ever going to be an ideal outcome. What we're trying to do is not lose ground. And what we're trying to do is have some wins each year. And for me, that was quite hard because at one level I was always thinking about the ideal. So I kept having conversations about, this is strong language, but it could be strengthened by. By the end, I was like, forget that. If it's strong, it's in, move on. It was really, I think, a bit of it could have been disheartening, but I think it's just about being real about that. So in terms of the outcomes, the agreed conclusions, as I said, seem to be the main game. And Mari gave a bit of an overview of what she felt and what the Australian government felt were the big wins out of those conclusions. And I think there were some areas where there was some really significant challenges. Some of those have been mentioned. So the concept of women's human rights, the concept of financing for development. How are we going to fund this work? How are we going to continue to sustain this work? Sexual and reproductive rights, intersectionality, the concept of the family, sexual identity and gender orientation, gender identity and sexual orientation, and sovereignty were the ones that over and over again caused issues in the negotiations and disrupted and derailed the negotiations. I might come back to just a couple of tactics around that, but one of the things that I was really aware of was sometimes I think in the Australian context we have conversations where we all assume a level of understanding about language and wording, but in the international context, suddenly you realise that actually one word makes the difference between whether these rights are afforded to women or not. And just 3 examples of that. The one that we talk about a lot is the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive health. So CSW absolutely starts, but we don't want anything about reproductive anything in there. We then get, okay, well, we'll concede some language about reproductive health. But reproductive health and reproductive rights are really different things. And so in some countries, reproductive health would simply be access to safe birthing facilities. Whereas what we're talking about when we talk about reproductive rights is obviously much more detailed. And so knowing where those language points are and making sure that you're constantly reviewing every iteration of the language, that it hasn't gotten either accidentally or deliberately dropped in one of the drafting processes is really critical. The family and families. Who would have thought in the plural it had a totally different meaning? The family is used by some countries and regions as a way of saying the family is defined by a man, a woman and their children. And so obviously if you contextualise the rights afforded to women as within the family or women's role within the family, it starts to be a very different conversation to the diversity of the family and the concept of families and acknowledging that doesn't look the same for every person. One of the things I was really impressed by was our negotiator making a really strong representation on this point and saying in the Australian context that the concept of family being narrowly defined as is being discussed is unacceptable for 2 reasons. One is about recognising that the whole concept of a relationship between a man and a woman defining anything anymore is totally outdated. But the other part of this is about our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and their definition of the family being really different. So to define it so narrowly is actually really problematic for us. And I remember thinking, that's actually incredible, because what she's done is opened the discussion up and tried to put forward a different argument, because sometimes there's sort of stalemate issues. And so we had some really strong, positive, impressive things come out of our negotiators. And the other one was early and forced marriage. So I actually didn't see this one coming. The word early became really problematic. Let's just talk about forced marriage. That includes early marriage. We don't need to mention early. And initially I thought, all right, I didn't know why that was a problem. But it turns out that child marriage is unacceptable under all of the conventions that relate to the rights of the child. So everyone sort of vaguely accepts that to be true. And so forced marriage picks up the rights of children, except where countries define children as different age bracket from where the convention describes children. So in some countries, if a child only has the rights afforded to children until they're 14, then forced marriage only captures them as a child. So there's this gap, which we would term, adolescent girls, where the rights stop being afforded. So just some of those things, which I guess until you're there, you kind of can't quite see coming, but you're suddenly involved in this conversation thinking, hang on, what's the issue with the word early? And I think that was an interesting reflection. Very aware of time. I won't go into too much detail about the HIV resolution, but what I did see in that process was, again, the same issues coming up over and over again. Australia making very strong representations about all of the things that people in this room would want us making representations about, but also being willing to walk away if language derailed one of our fundamental principles. So Australia was fighting very strongly for the reproductive rights language to be in, for the rights of sex workers, and particularly the use of the term sex workers and not prostitution or other illegal behaviour, some of those sorts of terms that get discussed, and also for the acknowledgement of the rights of adolescent girls. And that negotiation actually fell down, so it fell apart. And at the end, there was an agreement between the countries, and it was decided that it would be put to a vote on the floor. Then what we saw take place was the tactics kicked in. And so what the EU realised was, on some technicalities, we could actually propose amendments to the resolution from the floor and then seek a vote on each of the amendments. And so that, again, in 2 minutes or less, that resolution actually was passed, but with changes that had not been agreed in the room being passed from the floor, which was a really exciting thing to be part of, and I think meant we got a much stronger outcome than if we'd tried to land it in the negotiation room. I think it's really important to be clear about, for NGOs, as tactics, whether we're advocating to the Australian government or whether we're advocating to other governments. I think we spent a lot of time asking the Australian government to make sure they did things they already do. And I think actually we could spend all of that energy advocating on the issues where we know there's going to be challenges, rather than making representations. Mari, it's really important that we see Australia make representations about women's leadership. That stuff Australia's been doing for years. Australia is advocating for really good language in most of the areas where our NGOs are passionate. So let's try and, I think, be strategic around what we're actually spending our time asking for. In terms of influencing the drafting of the agreed conclusions process, we've briefly touched on it. I think there's three options in my mind of where we can do this. One is through, as NGOs, either together or individually, writing submissions to the Office for Women about what we want to see in the agreed conclusions, noting that they're going to be short, noting that we need to be really succinct, and noting that we probably don't need to fight the fights on all the things that have been agreed over the last 5 years. So let's focus our statements on where we think the issues are contentious. I also think we're always surprised. I constantly am the person being like, the Office of Women didn't give me enough time to write this submission. The formal submission process will take place. Let's assume it will. Let's start writing those now so that we're not shocked when there's a 10 or a 14-day process, because, let's just get moving on it now. I think the other opportunity is to go to UN Women directly, and so the National Committee has sought some advice from UN Women about how they might use, if Australia wrote a joint submission signed off by all of our organisations, can we feed that directly to the UN Women drafting team as a second way of trying to get influence in the drafting process? So we'll come back to you once we get some advice there. So that's step one. I think step two around tactics is reviewing the zero draft. So it comes out usually a couple of weeks before CSW. And we had some fantastic support from WAVE, from the Girl Guides, from Women with Disabilities, who literally wrote us a couple of pages on, this is great, this is terrible, this is missing. And it meant that before we even got there, we had some ideas about that. And I'd encourage you all to be as direct as retain, cull, strengthen, or reword. Because, again, lots and lots of time was spent talking about the need to retain language rather than just saying retain. We don't need to have a conversation about why to retain. Equally, cull. Assume that the Office for Women knows why you're suggesting it gets culled. They can always come back to you and check if they don't. But it's in the strengthening and the rewording that the main game actually is. And I think my experience this year was we probably spent more than half our time discussing the retain or cull bit. And actually, that's not where the opportunity is. So that's the review, the zero draft before we go. While we're there, I think making really specific suggestions, so not sending 2 or 3 page briefings and things to the government, but really specific. Here is one dot point we know X is being discussed today, here is one dot point that we think you can use. Because ultimately when you're sitting at that desk, literally I dropped my papers about 16 times because you just have paper flying everywhere. And I think it's about, you don't have a desk, you just need to kind of keep that messaging really clear. And I think the other thing that's really hard for me personally to say and really hard for NGOs to do is to try and identify what's the best case, what are the okay alternatives, and what are the not acceptables. Because it's actually in that what are the okay alternatives where we've got some room to move. We can't always get the best case. And so continuing to say this is the best case, okay, we get that. How do we? And so for me, it was really useful to think about how the National Committee for UN Women will think about this going forward, about how do we make our approaches really targeted. The other piece is what will we give away? We have to give some stuff away in order to get important language. So any advice that you can give the NGO delegates about stuff you think could be traded is helpful. I hesitate to say this on camera because I feel like it may come back to bite me at some point. But I think it's also sometimes about trusting our government. We're really lucky with the access we get to the Australian government. I think we're lucky that we have a government that makes very strong representations about issues that are contentious. There was a situation in the second week, which some of you would be aware of, where we couldn't get the language about early and forced marriage through and it was becoming a real issue. One government suggested what was a massive compromise as an alternative, and Australia said, no, we're not agreeing to that compromised position. The NGOs went wild, there was tweeting, there was hundreds of emails saying, you need to get the Australian government to sign up to this, Australia's not supporting early and forced marriage, can you believe it? People were sending me, the minister said this, she's now not supporting early and forced marriage. But actually in the room what had happened was the Australian government said, no, it's too weak and we believe we can trade something else later to get stronger language. And so I think there was a whole flurry of concern and activity and kind of whipping, not just from Australia but globally. There was a tweet that went out that said, everyone grab the Australians as they come out of the room, you know, they've failed early forced marriage. Sue and I really need to go to the bathroom, not leaving the room. So I think sometimes it's about trusting that actually, does it seem likely that Australia would give away early and forced marriage? Probably not. Let's have a conversation with them about what the tactics might have been there. And obviously sometimes they can't share that, but sometimes they can. And focusing on the areas of contention, the other thing is just to note it moves really fast. So the issues, we need to move really quickly on them. And it was fantastic to be able to walk out into the corridor and say, I need help on this. And have about 12 people go, I'll get you that, I'll get you this, I'll get you that. Because, you know, there's so few people in the room. So I'm really grateful to all of you for never questioning why we needed the information and for also recognising that when we did come out and say, help on this, not giving us a barrage of other information that sometimes it was just urgent. So in terms of next steps, I think we should continue to debrief on CSW 58. I don't think this should be the end of the conversation. I think we can start now in preparing for 59 and the panel's about to chat about that in more detail. I think we can organise our own pre-departure briefing. So if that's something that we want to do, we can actually do one in September. We can then do another one in November. But I actually think it's something we can self-organise and that would help the Office for Women, I think, greatly. I think there's absolutely a responsibility for Sue and I to do a formal handover to the next NGO delegates, and I hope that one of the things we felt very strongly about this year was how do we make sure that the role of NGO delegates on the government delegation stays, and I really hope that it does, but it's something we were very, very mindful of the whole way through the process. Communications, I think the Facebook group was fantastic in terms of being able to share information. I think Twitter is now gaining momentum, so everyone who's not on Twitter should get on Twitter ahead of CSW next year. I think the email group made me want to stick a pen in my eye on many occasions, but we will find a way. I commit to working out how to manage the email group. And the other thing I would just encourage whoever the next NGO delegate is to do is build into your 2 weeks of time commitments 2 days at the end to reflect on the experience. Because we got back to work on the Monday morning, we were back at work that day, and all of a sudden a month's passed, and actually coming today has been the first time to really reflect on what does this mean? What was the experience? What's the outcome? So maybe when you're thinking about that 2 week commitment, think about it as 2 weeks and 2 days. Thank you.